Welcome to the Trainer's Bullpen. We're trainers in the law enforcement space that come to hear experts talk about their work, their experience, and their research into human performance, particularly as it relates to the critical aspects of training, motor learning, and crisis decision-making. The purpose of the Trainer's Bullpen is to help bridge the gap between law enforcement training and the findings of academic research and current pedagogical best practices. Our desire here at the Trainer's Bullpen is to help advance law enforcement training, make research applied, and improve officer and public safety. The Trainer's Bullpen is a production of Raptor Protection, and I'm Chris Butler, your host for today. And it's my pleasure to welcome back to the Bullpen Dr. Tim Lee. Dr. Lee is a professor emeritus at McMaster University's Department of Kinesiology in Hamilton, Ontario. His research concerns motor learning, how individuals acquire and transfer motor skills from the training environment to places of work and play. He has published more than 140 research investigations in peer-reviewed psychology and kinesiology journals. Tim is the author of the book Motor Control in Everyday Actions and the co-author of the books Motor Learning and Performance and Motor Control and Learning, now in their 6th editions. In 2012, Tim was inducted as an honorary director of the PGA of Canada, for which he also serves as a technical advisory board member and as a gold coaching certification instructor for the Titleist Performance Institute. In addition, Tim consults frequently for the Force Science Institute in Mankato, Minnesota, and has delivered keynote addresses at their 2022 conference. Tim has been a lifelong competitive athlete in a number of sports and still competes regularly in senior amateur competitions in Canada and the US. He lives in Ancaster, Ontario, nearby a blended family that includes 8 grandchildren. Well, Tim, thanks, and welcome back to the Bullpen.
Thank you very much. And by the way, Chris, I just had a Christmas dinner with all 8 of my grandchildren just 2 days ago, and it was 3 days ago, and it was wonderful.
Oh, no kidding. What a gift. That's awesome. Yeah, good for you.
That was great.
Yeah, well, Merry Christmas, by the way.
Thank you. Merry Christmas to you.
Yeah, thanks. So, Tim, we are going to be talking today about an important topic that touches near and dear to law enforcement training, and that is the role of pressure in law enforcement training. So it's also, been understood by other names, of course, different terms for that thing, stress inoculation, anxiety training, stress training, pressure training. So I guess the first thing that I'll ask is, should we be discerning differently between those different terms, Tim, or in your experience as a motor learning expert, are they sort of all in the same pail?
I think that they all kind of touch on a similar topic, and that is, what happens when an individual is put in a situation where perhaps their expectation to perform maybe is not up to the level of what they think the task might demand. And as a result, they're put under pressure of anxiety going into their ability to succeed in that situation.
Okay, so, this is important in law enforcement because, for example, if we look at the average hit accuracy in law enforcement shootings, it's really, when you compare hit accuracy in training, typical qualification shooting and firearms training where you get very good accuracy, and yet something strange happens between the training environment and the criterion environment, and accuracy plummets dramatically. And that's just with firearms training. And, as a control tactics instructor, we see the same thing happen in motor skill in DT control tactics type of environments where you wonder what's happened. Your students can perform well in a clinical type of environment in the mat room, but then when they're under real pressure, Tim, is where we see sometimes serious choking. And we're not talking about athletes where choking means you might lose the match. We're talking about serious injury or perhaps death for a law enforcement officer. So this is a really important topic. So Tim, just before we get into it, you had provided two papers for me to review that we may just be referring to. So I'll just let the viewers know what these are in case we do. One is called "The Negative Consequences of Pressure on Marksmanship May be Offset by Early Training Exposure to Contextually Relevant Threat Training, a Systematic Review and Meta-Analysis." And that's a recent paper, 2022, published in Human Factors. And that's researchers from Australia. So to make it easy, we'll refer to that one as the Australia paper. And then the second paper is called "Pressure Training for Performance Domains, a Meta-Analysis." And this is a very interesting paper published in 2020. And this is out of researchers in the UK, out of Essex. So we'll refer to this one as the UK paper. So we got the Australia paper and the UK paper. Okay. So,
Right.
All right, Tim.
Maybe before we go on, Chris, I'll just explain to your viewers what the term meta-analysis means. It's really a statistical way of doing a review of the literature, and by statistical, it simply gathers up the research studies that have been published previously, and instead of going through them and describing each one in a narrative fashion, what they do is they take each paper and take results out of each paper, and the results out of each paper essentially become a data point, a single data point. So if you have 20 studies, then you have 20 data points, and now you can statistically analyze those data points to see if they all tend to go in the same direction, or whether they cancel each other out, or whether there are some things that are more indicative of a positive result than another. And then they can parse down those 20, for example, investigations into a smaller microstructure analysis. And it's really a kind of a way of attacking a review from a more quantitative way. So just a little bit of background.
Okay, no, that's helpful. Thanks for that. And in looking at these studies, I see that, and I guess this must be something that's typical of a meta-analysis, is they basically started in their literature collection with thousands of papers and then kept narrowing it down and narrowing it down. And I think one paper ended up with 14 papers that met the criteria, right, and the other one was very similar. So
yeah, there are certain ways of reducing it, not purposefully reducing it, but they have to meet certain criteria. First of all, the paper has to make the numbers that they need to do the analysis. They need to have published those in the paper, and if they're not available, then they're not able to use. Like you need more than just an average score, but you also need some measure of the variability that went into that average score. And if that's not available in the paper, then it's really of no use, so it gets chucked out. And so it really, in the end, they probably reduce it to the small subset of best possible papers that achieve the highest standard in terms of methodology, and also which report the data necessary to do the meta-analysis.
Okay, great. So Tim, we want to build police officers who have the ability to maintain good perception, decision-making, motor performance in rapidly unfolding high-threat conditions. And so can you start by just telling us about the role of pressure? Why is pressure an important part of that process, and how do we understand that?
Yeah, I just want to backtrack on something you said a few minutes ago, and you were talking about evidence that in police training you see accuracy levels in shooting performance decrease when you go from the range to an actual confrontational situation. And I just wanted to point out that that's the measurable observation, the accuracy of shooting. But what's not measurable, Chris, is things like, what are they seeing? Are they actually, seeing the whole scene? And when they get into a confrontational situation, now you get tunnel vision. Those little examples of an attention, where you have a broad scope of attention when there's little pressure on, and all of a sudden now in a high pressure situation, that attentional focus is really quite narrow. And those are things that are not measurable. And so even though accuracy in shooting performance may go down, it may be because of some of these unmeasurable factors, such as attention and perception. So I just wanted to mention that, and that there's a whole conflux of probably associated variables that go into the reason why shooting performance is diminished. But certainly, to answer your question, when you get into a situation, and again, this has been studied not only with police and law enforcement agents, but also the effects of pressure and anxiety have been studied in many different aspects, in sporting performance, in musical performance. Someone gets on stage, and I remember when my daughter performed her very first probably first and only piano recital. Oh my goodness, she could barely walk up on stage. People performing in or public speaking in front of an audience, the anxiety levels that are associated with that. All of these factors kind of, you merge into a similar set of situations where the individual is placed in a performance situation where perhaps their confidence level in performing up to the level they expect is now suspect, in that they kind of go, can I really do this or not? And now they start to feel the uncertainty that perhaps their performance is going to be able to match the expectation. And tied in with that are all kinds of other factors that impose on expectations, such as what they might feel others might think of them if they don't to snuff, whether those people are there, for example, in an audience, or whether they will see the results later when the results are known to everyone. All of these things tend to weigh on the individual, and it is a burden that now an individual must perform skills that maybe they know quite well, or maybe they don't know quite well, but probably have never performed them in that situation before under that kind of pressure-inducing anxiety.
Okay, so you said something really interesting there, Tim. You're talking about the worry, the effect of worry and anxiety on the performer. And is that tied then to this whole idea of like Nidafer's quadrants of attention, internal versus external? So if a performer, let's say if a police officer becomes internally focused, they're focused on worry, they're focused on doubt, they're focused on their inability or their perceived inability to meet the demand, does that result in performance problems and choking? And so is that the effect of pressure that can cause that wrong response?
That's a good question. And this is where I'm going to beg off a bit, Chris, and say I'm starting to reach the edge of my level of expertise. I'm a motor learning person. I'm not a psychologist, and certainly not a sport or clinical psychologist. So the internal mechanisms that are going on with respect to the psychological factors that go with fear and anxiety and pressure are a little beyond my level of expertise. But be that as it may, there are certain physiological factors that do tend to emerge. Heart rate picks up, your breathing becomes more shallow. There may be increase in the sweat that on the skin that results in all of these factors that are associated with anxiety, fears and anxiety.
Sure. Okay. But so let's look at it from a motor learning perspective, though, Tim, like information processing. So that's critical for great motor learning performance, right? Picking up on those critical cues in the environment. And so, like, because you mentioned the worry, the doubt, and all of that type of stuff. And so how does that affect the performer's ability to attend to those critical cues in the environment and pick up that relevant information?
Right. We one of the I think one of the least well known, but I think very influential theories of learning is called progression regression, and that is that as we learn, we progress to greater levels of performance inducing factors or related factors. We're able to focus more clearly and specifically on things when we are looking at the environment. We're able to attend selectively to cues that we know are more predictive of future performance. And these are the progressive nature. This is the progressive nature of learning. But two things can happen, Chris. One is that if you take time away from the skill, then you tend to regress. And the other thing is that when you're put into a stressful situation, you tend to regress. And by regress, that is, you go back to a level of performance that you're probably an expert at before you progress to a new level. So if you think about, let's think, just to say, for example, that there are 5 stages of learning in any kind of activity. But just for example, you go from one stage to another stage to another stage to another stage, and you don't move on to a second stage before you've perfected the first stage. But now the second stage is qualitatively better than the first stage. And once you perfect that, you progress to a third stage and you progress to a fourth stage. Well, when you take time away from a skill, or when you're put in situations of pressure or stress, you tend to revert back to the level that you previously had been an expert at. Okay, and with that is probably a diminished level of attention, focusing cues, a reduced level of perceptual awareness, and with that is this notion of internal and external focus of attention. When you start out learning a skill, you're very internally focused, and as you progress to higher levels of expertise, you tend to become more externally focused. So with that notion of progression regression, if you're put into a stressful situation, you're probably going to regress back to a more internalized focus of attention.
Okay. And so then what's the relationship between, like, how does training with pressure, and I want to get into what does that even look like, because I know that's really the meat of this. What our viewers want to hear is, so what does that look like in my world? What does training under pressure mean? So we'll get there, but what is the relationship so these meta-analysis and in all your research and your experience, what's the relationship between training under pressure and performance in the criterion environment? What do we see in the research?
Well, I think first of all, what you see in the research is that training tends to be very specific, and that is what you train, or the skills that you train, are essentially the skills you learn. Okay, and I know I'll always refer to some golf things, because this is what something I'm most familiar with. But if you spend all of your time hitting a 7-iron on the practice range, then you're probably going to be really good hitting that 7-iron out on a flat lie on a golf course. But if now you have to hit a 6-iron out of a rough with high slope, now the skill that you developed hitting that 7-iron on the practice range is going to be limited you're going to be limited in the ability to execute that with a different club under different situations. So what we practice tends to be what we learn, and that seems to be something that that has been kind of a bedrock of not only motor learning research, but learning research in general over many years. I'll get to your answer in just a minute, Chris. But
can I just clarify? So, Tim, can I just clarify something? I'll make sure that I understand what you just said. So, because what you
Yep.
practice is what you learn. But when you gave the example, so you're basically referring to, if we practice in this very strict context, this skill, then that's the
right.
skill that we will learn, but only within that context. If you vary the context, the skill might not transfer. Is that what you're saying?
You're going to be there will be some transfer, Chris, but maybe not as much transfer as you might expect. I think that your ability to transfer is going to be diminished somewhat if you've never experienced the new situation under which you perform. Here's an example from, we've all taken tests, exams. Most people who go to university will have experienced this, and that is that you learn material in a course in a classroom, and now at the end of the term, you're shuffled into a gymnasium to write the exam. You know, the context of the gymnasium is completely different from the classroom in which you learn the material. And what studies have shown is that if you write the exam in the classroom where you learn the material, you're going to get much higher score in the exam than if you're now shuffled into a gymnasium to write the exam. And you use the word context, and that's exactly what's going on. You change the context from which you learn the material to where you now have to apply the material. You're going to be at a disadvantage. And that's been shown in many different types of applications where you switch the context, and now you may be able to do it, but maybe you won't be able to do it quite as well or perform quite as well as if you were in the same context. So having said that, a lot of this research and I'll be honest with you, I've never conducted research involving police under pressure situation training, so I've just been reading the literature. But a lot of these studies, what they'll do is they will induce in training, they will induce an anxiety or pressure situation during a series of training episodes or sessions, and compare that to another group of individuals who do the exact same training, but either under a low pressure situation or no pressure situation. And now they, after the end of training, they'll do a performance test either immediately or down the road somewhere, where they're either performing it under no stress or under a very stressful situation. And usually in a lot of those studies, most of them that I've read, results in an advantage for the people that have trained in a pressure situation. Now, you ask, what types of pressure situations have they used? Well, in the police training studies I've read, a lot of times the training will be, or the pressure inducing conditions will involve either the assailant firing soap cartridges back at the police officer. In one study, I think was conducted in Asia, it was a SWAT team that was looking at, they were training in situations where the assailant was holding a hostage, and they were having to fire their weapon and not try to hit obviously the hostage. And so that type of training was being undertaken in a high anxiety related scenario where innocent people could be theoretically harmed. Of course, they weren't using real live ammunition, but that was the training situation. In other studies where there induced pressure, there was, for example, a basketball study where they were performing 3 free throws, and anxiety was being introduced by, there were several factors involved. They would have I think a small crowd watching the individual shoot the basketball. The player was told that their performance was being evaluated, and up to snuff, they were going to lose playing time. And they were also being filmed for later analysis. All these things in which a person starts to question whether their own ability lives up to the expectations that are being demanded of them. Another study was, I remember quite well because I don't like heights. And this was a study in which they were throwing darts, and the individuals were 20 feet up on a climbing wall and throwing darts at a target. So the anxiety was being induced by their distance off the floor. Now, everything was, of course, done in a safe way, but still, if it was me, I could just imagine being quite highly anxious. But the whole idea is that they're learning in these conditions of pressure training. They're learning to perform the skill under a high pressure situation or under conditions of high anxiety. And even though their performance in that training may not be great or may not be up to snuff, as a result of that training, they're going to be better able to perform the transfer situation than those that hadn't undergone that pressure training. So the idea is that don't focus on how well they do during the training, but focus on how well they have learned to adapt to pressure during training, and how that prepares them now for a situation where they might have to perform under pressure. And the idea is that having learned under pressure, now you're in a better position to be able to perform under pressure when the time comes, if it's needed.
Okay, so Tim, with that, like, I think this may be a new concept for some of the viewers, but because what you said there is like, don't focus on the performance during the training event, but really, I mean, that's what we have done historically in law enforcement training, is our measure of our measure of the skill of our student is what are they doing during the training event. And so I think what you just hit on there is that notion of online versus offline learning, and where does the actual motor learning really take place. So because I think
Right.
there's probably going to be some confusion in hearing, what do you mean don't focus on performance during training? So can you help us understand, like, what is the relationship between online and offline learning, and why is it that performance can improve even after the training event? Or not can, it usually often does improve after the training event.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question, Chris. I'm glad you brought that up. You know, in motor learning, we call that distinction between performance and learning. And bottom line is that performance is what's observed. That's the observable, and learning is the kind of the unobservable. It's the change within the individual that sticks, if you will. It's that change that that is going to be there the next time you perform, and that change is not always correlated or consistent with performance. You can get really good changes, in positive changes in learning, without any observable change in performance. And in contrast, you can get quite large changes in performance that really are not indicative of all of anything that sticks. So you can create all kinds of situations. And I'll go back to golf. You can create situations in golf where you're guided to make 50 putts in a row. You know, having a line on the ground, having you know, something that guides the putter, and you'll make 50 putts in a row, and you might say, "Oh, wow, that's, you know, the perfect performance. I've learned so much." And then you go out the next day and you're just as bad as you were the previous day, because the change in performance is not always correlated with learning. And learning really is that internalized change that stays over time and is able to transfer to different situations. So when I say don't really pay much attention to what goes on in training, what we're trying to, I think what this research shows, that training under pressure, you're really not, let's say that, just by argument, let's say that your shooting performance in a condition in which there's no pressure is, let's say, 50% accuracy. And under conditions of high anxiety or a lot of pressure, let's say it drops to 20%. And let's say that you do several training sessions in which that training under pressure goes from 20, let's say, up to a high of 30%. Well, you might say, okay, well, they've never really reached 50%. How can you say that there's any learning going on or anything like that? Well, if now you take both those groups later and have them perform under a high anxiety situation, well, that control group that was always at 50%, now they're going to drop down to 15%. And that group that trained under pressure is still going to stay at 30%. Okay, so obviously pressure is having a negative impact on performance, and it always will. But those people that learned under those conditions are now better able to handle it and better able to perform under pressure situations than this devastating effect it's going to have on someone who's never had experience under those conditions of practice.
Tim, one of the things that stood out to me in one of the papers, I think it was the Australia paper, is they spoke about the importance of doing that Luis mentioned, contextualization, but they stressed that like doing that contextualization, adding pressure early on in skill development. And so, in other words, what I took from that is they're saying, yeah, no, don't wait until your performers demonstrate an exceptional level of skill performance and then start adding on pressure. What they're saying is, as soon
Right.
as they start performing the skill, start adding pressure on at that point. So
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
interesting. What can you say about that?
Yeah. I think what they're saying is that that you can't, that maybe you can't learn a new skill, kind of decontextualize, if you will. If you're going to learn and expect, and this is another key, is that really, what are you preparing an individual for? If you can look down the road and understand what scenarios that you're trying to prepare the individual for, then I think you backtrack and try to prepare that individual from the beginning. This is where we're trying to get to, and we're trying to get you involved in these situations as early as possible, such that now, while you're learning the skill, you're learning it in the context of what you're going to have to do. And sorry if I'm beating a golf horse example to death here, but someone who learns for 2 years on a driving range, and goes out onto the golf course for the first time is going to be at a severe disadvantage to that person that practices some and plays some and practices some and plays some, and begins to understand what the context is of the skills that they're trying to improve upon. And I think that that's true in whether it's a sporting event or a musical skill you're trying to learn. And if you're trying to learn to perform a musical skill that you want to be able to perform in front of others, experience of performing others while you're learning, I think, rather than expect to be able to do it all at once after you've learned something. And it's the same type of thing with pressure. If you are expecting to be put into a situation where you have to perform the skill under pressure, then you should be introducing that as you're developing the skill during the learning phase. And maybe doing it at the beginning might not be the best, but introducing it early on and making the conditions of practice a little bit more stressful, a little bit more difficult, but in a I guess in a highly desirable way, is something that is going to benefit the learner in the long run in getting to that situation where they can perform under pressure or out, in the I guess in the goal state,
Right.
what they're trying to achieve.
Okay, so can I give you a couple of examples and then you can tell me how would we add pressure on, or is this an example of how a law enforcement trainer might add pressure? So let's take handcuffing, for example. Tim, if you watch a lot of handcuffing training, it's all the students have short sleeve shirts on, their wrists are bare, they've got no long sleeve shirts or coats, the environment is well lit, so we do a lot of repetitions of how to load the cuffs, how to move in, how to apply them on. And that is, like you said earlier, it's a very narrow context of when those cuffs would be put on that way. And the reality is they're almost never put on that way in the real world. And so the first time they go to put a cuff on somebody who's got a long sleeve sweater or a jacket on, and now the clothing gets caught in the cuff, now what we see is they're stuck. It's almost like they've choked. They don't know what's just happened and how do I solve this problem. So would contextualization or adding pressure, let's stick with pressure, would pressure in that environment look like? Because I think sometimes trainers hear that word pressure and they think these big massive scenarios with role players and everything else happening, and that certainly is pressure, but we're talking about, like, let's start in when we're learning these motor skills, why don't, and we're doing handcuffing, for example, why don't we have some of our students put on shirts, on jacket, long sleeve shirts and jackets? Why don't we lower the lighting
Right.
level? So we change the visual acuity, like that's adding pressure, right?
Absolutely. That, and you could take that even further. You could lower the lighting. You could uh, do it in a cold room. So you got a cold environment. Now your hands aren't working maybe quite as well as they were before. You could have music blaring, or you could have a lot of people talking in the background, such that now maybe you can't hear the cufflinks or the cuffs as they go on. And all those sensory factors that maybe aren't obvious, but probably are used subtly in performing the skill, now become disrupted, and you have to perform the skill with the deterioration of all those sensory consequences. And absolutely, that all adds to the pressure, because now you don't have all the perfect hearing, you don't have perfect vision, you don't have perfect touch because it's cold, and all those things now begin to add up to feelings like, am I up to task to do this or not? And that's where the pressure arises.
So Tim,
yeah, that's a great.
Okay. Is a helpful way then for trainers to think about this is to kind of imagine, like, what is the criterion environment going to look like on the street, and take some of those cues and bring them into the training environment early on, and start embedding those into whatever motor skill training you're doing, whether that's handcuffing, ground fighting, firearms. Like, let's start adding contextual variability as soon as possible.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And you raised the term variability there, which I think is key, is that you don't do it the same way every time. Add something different, or add something unique, so that the person, you're kind of catching the police officer unaware. They're having to adapt to something new, that the person is doing. All of a sudden the assailant is swearing at them, or they're fighting back or something. And it's I read a study where they're doing pressure training with firefighters, and what they found is that what they used was a live fire drill, and they used the same drill over and over and over again, and they found it to be rather ineffective. And the argument that the authors made was that because it was the same scenario over and over and over again, the firefighters weren't learning anything new, and it kind of became depressurized over time, if you will. So, as you just said, the word variety is key here in order to kind of contextualize the learning. And you can't predict what's going to happen. Every situation is going to be unique, which I think makes it even more important to try to vary the scenarios as much as possible.
Right. Okay, good. I once heard an interview with John Kessel, who's the director of Volleyball USA, and he said something that is right in line with what you just said. And he spoke about how, what he really thinks is the worst thing in volleyball is repetitive drills with no contextual relevance. And so he used this phrase. He spoke about read, plan, do, and he said everything your athlete does, you want them to have to read what's happening, make a decision, plan what they need to do, and then execute. So he had this problem solving. What I really took away from that, Tim, was the importance of our students, whether that's athletes or police officers, having to make decisions to solve problems in training. And the more that
exactly
do that, the better they're going to be.
Exactly. And that's a great example, because for the most part, the motor aspect of performing the skill is just one relatively small aspect in many cases. It's the decision making that goes into it that is critically important, and the preparation that leads to that, and the perception of the situation before the decision making happens, that is critically important. So this Kessel's approach to training really simulates what they have to do in a game. They have to read the situation, they have to make decisions, and then execute it. And if you're doing that in training, and that's what you need to do in the game, then it seems like a perfect match. And doing drills really takes away the decision making. It takes away having to read the situation. All you're focusing on is the movement. And I think that it's almost, I'm not going to say a waste of time, but it's certainly pretty much a waste of time to do training in that way. So yeah, Kessel is bang on.
Yeah, and I think, for law enforcement trainers, Tim, is our hardest challenge in this is going to be understanding that our focus is not on, as you said earlier, it's not on the performance that we see during the practice, because that's the problem. Is when we do a lot of drills, we drill, we get some sweet looking performance during practice,
Yep.
and we, hey, that's,
Yep.
look what they've accomplished today. And it's all with good intention. Like, trainers don't have bad intent, but the problem is we're assessing the wrong thing. What we want is great decision makers where their skills will transfer to a novel environment. And so it's entirely
Exactly.
approach.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly the case. And a lot of the research that I was involved with for many years was in interleaving versus blocking practice. And blocking practice was a very drill type method of practice that produces great results during the practice itself, but doesn't stick. And you compare that to interleaving or random practice that tends to depress performance, but the changes that occur during random or interleaving practice tend to stick. And in the end, retention of skills and transfer of skills is much better than under interleaving than in block practice or drill type practice. And so that underscores this idea that if you only focus on what they're doing in performance, then you would say, well, drilling is great, but if you really want to see what actually is retained and learned, then you have to kind of go to that underlying change that we can't really see all the time in learning. And the way to look at that is to see how they do on the criterion test, how they do in the game, or how they do out in the field. And sometimes that's very different than what you see during practice or during training.
So with stickiness, then let's go with that for a bit, because that's an important point, the retention of these skills. What do we see, Tim, in the research? If students train under conditions of pressure, has there been studies that have looked at the retention of those skills versus performers who don't train under pressure? What do we see there?
I seem to recall one or two studies that a lot of these studies are short term. I mean, they, for either the availability of the officers is a brief, or for whatever reason, they tend to, maybe do it over a few days or maybe a week or two. But I do remember a study that I think looked at retention after 4 months. And I seem to recall that that the skill that performing under pressure situation 4 months later was much better for the pressure trained group than the control group. But we're looking at probably a small sample size here in terms of number of studies that have looked at retention.
Okay. And Tim, is there a difference between novice and experts as well? So like is the benefit of pressure training different for training with novices than with already performers who are at an elite or expert level?
That's a good question. Again, from my recollection of the research and what I know about it, I think that um, that if the pressure training itself is novel, that is, if the experts haven't done pressure training, then I think you get as much benefit for the experts as you do the novices. But if the experts have performed under the pressure situation that they're going to be tested, then you probably won't see as much benefit as you would with novices. So
Okay.
I guess it really depends on how unique the pressure training and pressure testing situation is.
Right. And I guess one key there too would be, as we said earlier, you mentioned the importance of variability. So even if I'm an expert performer, if you were to take me and put me in an environment where now you're introducing context that I've not seen before, that would certainly be pressure for me.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. And it now we're getting to a situation, I think, where maybe there's limitations in the breadth of the research. You know, are all pressure inducing anxiety situations the same? You know, and I think it's only going to be with a lot more research where we where we start to see the limitations maybe in some of this and some of the nuances in the studies that will only come as more studies are done.
Okay, and Tim, in the time we have left, we're coming up rapidly to an hour. I can't believe how fast the time's gone already. But what I want you to help us with as well is because I think there's a caution here in that we don't want trainers to hear the word pressure and think that that means that you put this crushing complexity on your students that overwhelms their ability to perform. So, it on that dial of pressure, there's got to be a sweet spot there for each individual student because they're all at different
Yeah,
places. So two things.
yeah.
Can you tell us about the danger of excessive pressure on learning? And then two, can you give us some advice on so how would a trainer what kind of things should I keep in mind when should that I would know that I've added enough pressure, but not too much that I'm impairing learning?
Yeah, well, you mentioned earlier that getting to an individual who's at a point of freezing. That I guess there you're probably exceeding the limits of maybe the benefits of pressure training. I think what you want to do is get an individual outside of their comfort zone, get an individual into a situation of being uncomfortable with the pressure, the effects of the anxiety. I think you want to see some of the physiological changes that occur under pressure. You know, the um, uh, reduction in attentional focus, the maybe more shallow breathing, the elevated heart rate, and there are physiological measures now that my goodness, all you need is a cell phone, and you get a lot of those physiological measures. So these are not so difficult to measure anymore. So I think you want to try and achieve some of those physiological changes, but maybe not to a point where the individual is overwhelmed so much that they can't perform at all. So I think the skilled trainer is that person that can achieve that kind of sweet spot where they're challenging their trainees to exhibit anxiety levels that are beyond their comfort, but not so much that it overwhelms them.
Okay,
And
so
and this might be something that can be ramped up over time.
sure. So yeah, as they become more competent in their skills, you ramp up or scaffold up the pressure. So
Exactly.
what I want to ask you is, so you gave several indicators that would be, well, maybe we put too much pressure on our students there. But one thing I didn't hear you say is your students are making performance mistakes. And I think that that's really interesting because like error and mistake in learning is a vital component of the learning process. So if I put
Yeah.
pressure on my students and now they're having to make errors and fix them that's not an
Mhm.
indicator that I've put too much pressure on. That's actually a desirable outcome. Is that right?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I think you want to, I, I guess this goes back to the idea that um, errors are not bad. Errors, in fact, are good. Um, there's a view, I think, a mistaken view that if you make errors, then you learn to make errors. I think that that's absolutely wrong. Um, but errors can occur for many different reasons. It could be errors in reading the situation. It could be errors in decisions about what to do, or they could be execution errors. And all of those, you can read the situation right, but make the wrong decision, or you can make the right decision and execute it improperly. Um, and all of these are probably useful to learn from. Um, but and I know we're going to talk about feedback at some point. But here is an example where I think once an error is made, you want to give the trainee as much opportunity to evaluate what happened before they're told uh, what the error was, so that they learn from the self-evaluation process as well.
Right on. Yeah, I'm excited about talking to you later in another episode about feedback because more I listen to you and I read your stuff and stuff from other people is the method of feedback is an absolutely critical component to motor learning and
Mhm.
so we need to do it in the right way. We need to know what we're doing
Yeah.
as trainers. So um, is there anything on pressure as far as like the dose relationship or the frequency of pressure? How often should it be done? Where should it be done in the training cycle? Early, late, or in the training day, in the morning, in the afternoon? Like, is there anything on any of those?
I wish I had a great answer for you, Chris, but I just don't think that that the research is advanced enough to be able to make a definitive statement on that. Um, that certainly the dosage question is an important one, but I don't think. I mean, I mean, you think about studies that have been done; they've only been done in the last 12 to 14 years, really, um, with regard to the effects of pressure on police training and training pressure, in sports and other things, maybe 20 years. So it's really just been relatively recent in the whole context of learning research that these studies have been done. So um, I anticipate a lot more of them in the future, and maybe we'll be able to those questions about dosage and time of day and things like that. That great questions, but just not answerable just yet.
We don't know yet. Okay, Tim, what about the relationship between because we spoke about contextual variability and adding all that. And something that's popped in my mind as I'm listening to you talk is I read some papers about the relationship between high intensity training, 20 minutes of high intensity
Mm-hmm.
training, and the effect on motor learning, how it enhances motor learning. Could a trainer look at using high intensity training even as adding pressure on? Like, could that be embedded into the motor learning as a method of adding
Uh,
pressure?
hmm, that's interesting. Uh, my gut feeling is that is a different, probably a different application. Um, and I go back to the specificity effect. If you if you train a skill, if you learn a skill under fatigue situations, then you're probably going to be able to better perform that skill when you're in a fatigue pressure test situation. For example, if you're learning free throws, for example, under fatigued high intensity training, and you're learning to perform free throws under that, then you're probably going to be at a more of an advantage to make those free throws late in a game when you're tired than that person who's not trained under those high intensities, fatiguing situations. But I would say that those fatiguing situations are probably having a different physiological context than would high anxiety situations. So I don't see them as being equated, but I see them being similar in terms of the specificity of learning effect.
Okay. Oh, that's very helpful. Thank you for that. Now, so Tim, we're out of time. We're at the end of our hour, but what I want to give you the opportunity. Is there anything that you wished I would have asked you, or that you wanted to say about the relationship between pressure and training to help our law enforcement trainers?
Well, not in terms of what you asked me, but in terms of this research, I think I was very excited to see that it had been conducted. I think it's really important research to do, and if it helps keeps police officers safer out on the street, then I hope that there's a lot more of it conducted, because it certainly seems to be something that has a lot of value to it. I truly believe that.
Right on. I agree with that. And one of the things that they said in the Australia paper, just in relation to what you said, is they made this comment. They said, if the evolution of training over, and they're talking historically, has only led to small changes in performance, then the challenge to the lack of transfer, that is, that poor performance in the criterion environment, lies in the cognitive factors and the threat response training, not in the motor skill acquisition, which is what you said earlier, is
Right.
You're talking about it's the cognitive aspects of performance that law enforcement really needs to start embracing.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I know people are doing their best out there, and I think it's the job of people that are involved in research to help share some of these ideas with the trainers to maybe help continue to improve training environments.
Well, and you certainly do that, Tim, and that's what I so appreciate about you, is your passion for public safety, for helping law enforcement trainers. And every time I talk to you and get the opportunity to listen to you, it's like I'm sitting at a feast, and there's just so much learning that comes from you and colleagues like you. So I want to thank you for what you do, for your dedication and your continued desire to just try to advance an evidence-based, research-based approach to helping law enforcement trainers. So thank you for your time, Tim, and thank you for what you do for us. We're going to append both of these papers as show notes to the presentation in case anybody wants to download them and read them. Tim, if any of our viewers want to contact you and reach out to you with questions, what's the best way for them to get in touch with you?
My email address is, and maybe you can post it somewhere, but it's scapps@mcmaster.ca. That's SCAPPS at McMaster, MCMASTER.ca. And always happy to receive emails, and usually reply quickly if I can.
Unless you're on the golf course.
And then I'll be a few hours delayed. Yeah.
Right. Okay. All right, Tim. Thanks very much for your time, my friend, and Merry Christmas to you and your family.
Thank you, Chris, and Merry Christmas to you and yours. Appreciate it. Thank you.